So today, I'd like to have a little talk with you about the effects of a basic income on inflation in the context of a fully automated economy. One thing to understand here is that the argument that a basic income will lead to hyperinflation is distinct from the argument that it will do so in the context of a fully automated economy. If we just assume that a basic income was fully implemented now in the current time, then the result almost certainly would be a troublesome amount of inflation. Increasing the amount of money in circulation is generally going to increase consumption, and if this leads to on-the-ground shortages, then prices are going to have to rise until this is resolved. This is the modern neoclassical synthesis economics 101 aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve. However, one thing to consider in the scenario of full automation is that the ability to increase supply in response to demand is likely to be very greatly increased. General price inflation comes from the product of aggregate supply and demand, and so if supply increases as greatly as demand, there's no particular reason to expect an inexorable tendency to inflation. There's evidence that under the right conditions, current automation can drastically increase supply compared to human workers. If we extrapolate towards the full automation scenario, then even if machines only reach a human level of capability, and that's where the laws of physics draw the line, their ability to labour 24/7 will in itself drastically increase productive capacity potential. Let's say that machines can have a 160-hour work week, minus 8 hours for maintenance, whereas humans have a 40-hour work week. That already quadruples potential supply in a week, not counting lower operating costs, no health and safety restrictions needed, no holidays, greater inherent capabilities, speed and efficiency and so on. If nuclear fusion is solved this century, as appears likely, discounting the always 30 years away canard and looking at the actual progress, then we will likely be able to supply the power for this. All this is assuming, of course, that a basic income guarantee under conditions of total technological unemployment would increase aggregate demand to begin with, which is where the objection based on inflation comes from. It's possible that the surplus money above that spent on subsistence equivalent to previous wage levels will go into a higher savings rate instead. We don't know. However, if the scenario is one where consumption is assumed to increase, leading to inflation, then under the same scenario of full automation, supply capacity is also going to be so correspondingly greater as to negate the inflationary effect of basic income. In fact, what you might expect is some short-term period of deflation, since technological unemployment will hit the middle and white-collar professional working class hardest. The blue-collar working and lumpen classes will simply see their wages replaced with a basic income and not see much difference, and the richest and most capital-owning classes stand to gain, whereas the professional class will see their income decline to the level of the basic income, as they can no longer compete with robots and maintain employment for their previously high wages. At least that will occur if this economic group doesn't buy into automated capital sooner or later. Consumption will not necessarily increase across the board under a scenario where the basic income replaces wages under full automation, as the increases in consumption of the very poorest may be offset by rather severe declines in consumption among the skilled middle-class white-collar workers, which may not be corrected until automated capital can become widespread enough to allow for new self-employment. My point is only that there's nothing intrinsic about a basic income regime in a fully automated economy that will inexorably lead to hyperinflation. The relationship between demand and supply will determine that, and current evidence is that increased automation would lead to increased aggregate supply. Of course, it's entirely possible that resource constraints could put paid to this, but since it's not clear that effective demand would actually be increased, at least in the early period, this would affect us even under the existing system of wages, if population pressure is the culprit. One of the problems with the basic income, of course, and even negative income tax interpretations, is that although it has support from across the political spectrum, notably from classical liberal Milton Friedman, the classical liberal and moderate libertarian support for the policy is generally as a replacement for current welfare schemes, as a baseline safety net for an increasingly automated society, and not as some kind of general scheme to level incomes. Progressives, meanwhile, are focused on inequality rather than poverty per se, and generally have a desire to redistribute as much as possible. If supply remains as it does, then the intuitive scenario of basic income leading to dangerous inflation, possibly even what would be classed as hyperinflation, is highly likely. One of the difficulties is that basic income will one day be needed, and as a replacement for wages, it will act to ensure the masses have some general basis of survival if the fully automated scenario comes to pass. But if it is put in place too early, it will represent some extra level of unconditional welfare on top of the existing system of means-tested welfare and wages. It suffers from transitional problems, and it's in that second contemporary scenario that the danger of inflation lies. This is why basic income should be treated as a specific solution to the specific problems of 21st century automation and the streamlining of an overly bureaucratic welfare system, and not as a means of achieving arbitrary levels of redistribution. This is all speculation either way, but the economics here involve the interaction between supply and demand, and not just the one or the other independently in a vacuum. The introduction of the policy must be done carefully, but if trends continue, will be necessary, and so this question is of continuing interest.